Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Whiting. I'm the Dean of the Graduate School of Design, and I'm delighted to kick off our fall 2020 programming early this year with an event that we scheduled specifically for this orientation week. I want to thank Erica George and Matt Smith for their help in organizing the event. I extend a warm welcome to our incoming students, many of whom come to us from around the world. And so we wanted to provide you with some context to enable you to understand the direct relationships that exist between our school's departments, architecture, landscape architecture, and urban planning and design, and the powerful overdue reckoning that's happening across America right now over structurally racist policies and practices that have long negatively impacted Black Americans. As historian Richard Rothstein, who appears in Owned, documents in his book, The Color of Law, the racial segregation of our cities results from federal, state, and local legislation. The repercussions of this segregation are manifold and stultifying, ranging from environmental considerations to educational opportunities, among other critical factors that impact life's trajectories. So we'll be discussing an excerpt from The Color of Law in a community conversation later this fall at the school. Tonight, we welcome to the GSD filmmaker Giorgio Angelini, principal owner of Section Perspective Films and director of the film that we've just watched, Owned: A Tale of Two Americas, which dates from 2018 and which tells the same story that Rothstein tells, though through a very different way. Giorgio's terrific name for his film company, Section Perspective, gives away his academic formation. He received his Master of Architecture degree from Rice in 2012, and the film owes its origins, I would say, to a travel grant that he received as a student. Documenting the impact of the 2008 housing crisis brought him to sites like Inland Empire, the inland region east of LA, where he found apocalyptic scenes of abandoned McMansions. Giorgio, welcome to the GSD. It's great to have you here, and it was wonderful to see the film again. I've seen it before. There's so much to talk about here, ranging from how your architectural education influenced how you created the story of Owned, how you put it together visually and verbally, to the relationship between Owned and the contemporary discussions of structural racism in America. Can you start by speaking to either or both of these points before we open the floor to questions from the audience? I warned you I would start with a pretty big question.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. This is really special and unique and new for me. So hello to the 71 attendees. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, when I applied to architecture school, I was actually deeply conflicted about whether or not I wanted to apply to architecture school or film school. And in the infinite wisdom of my mother, she said, I really think you should try architecture. It's a much more foundational education. And that's what she had done with herself.
Yeah, she was an architect. So of course
right.
She saw that.
Of course. But it also was like, and this was before we'd known that you were going to start there, because of course, if I'd known that you were going to be dean at Rice, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. But I think you began my second semester. But you said something like really pithy but profound very early on. I think maybe in your like initial lecture to all the students in your first semester there, you said that architecture is political, and it really. I tended to agree with that statement on its face, but like it really sent a kind of lightning bolt through our studio that night. And I remember having a really intense conversation with one of my cohorts about whether that statement was true or not. And of course, this was all in like the background of the housing crisis. And we had all these incredible lecturers coming who obviously like didn't have very much work to do at the time because, there was no money to build anything. Yeah. So we were like in this moment of consternation, trying to think about like what architecture, what role it would be, what it would play in sort of fixing or ameliorating these conditions that it had kind of played a part in creating in the first place. And so, I don't know, as an architectural education, I don't think that I could have ever made this film without it for sure. I think like understanding, it was the first time in my life that I've ever was forced to think about creativity as a discipline and as a process, and not in my previous life as a musician is something that I thought that was like divine intervention or something like that. So
We got that out of you.
yeah, exactly.
And now, I mean, it was a prescient film to make in 2018. As I noted to you before this all started, I was impressed to see that you got Nicole Hannah-Jones as one of your speakers, Richard Rothstein, who I referenced. I mean, you have an amazing cast of characters that you brought together, but you also hit upon a topic and the issue of racist segregation practices in America before this became the topic of everyone's
Right.
talking about. So how has this summer struck you?
I guess long overdue, but I have to say, like, yeah, when I started making this film in earnest, as you'd intimated, it kind of started from a photography grant that I got one in the last year at Rice, but I started really in 2014, and it was really, frankly, quite difficult to find either private funders or granting bodies that were willing to invest in the film, because the reoccurring note that I kept on getting was like, what does suburbia and inner city America have to do with one another? Or what, haven't we already covered the housing crisis? Like, why are you going to make another housing crisis film? And the film's germination really came out of that question, or the unanswered questions that hadn't been asked during the crisis. And so I took, again, your advice during our thesis. You said that, like, the best thesis, what was it? You're going to say it better than me because you've said it in the first place, but about being at the buffet table, like you don't want to be alone.
Yeah, you want to make sure other people are interested in your topic.
Yeah, or that you're building off of an existing conversation. You're not on your own island. And
Yeah.
so very early on, it felt like I was on my own island. But the more research I did, I found that people like Richard and people like Nicole were also having these conversations, albeit in kind of smaller ways at that time. And so they were kind enough to lend their voices. And this summer has been a really catalyzing moment. And I guess the upside is that, I put out this film essentially by myself, and it's been a really uphill battle to get people to see it. But like over the summer, very naturally, we've had just a flood of people checking it out. And it's been very moving. I think there's finally a moment of recognition from the general public who've often been resistant to talking about this history, which is precisely why I made the film in the first place. I think there's a kind of cognitive dissonance that often happens, and you can see it in some of the illustrious reviews the film has received on Amazon or IMDb. I mean that facetiously, the 1-star reviews. But yeah, it's. I'm glad that we're finally having this conversation.
So I'll turn to some of the questions, and then if there's room for me to continue asking you about things, I'll return to those. But we have a bunch of questions that are queuing up already. And I want to start with a fairly big one from Steve Irvin, which is what are the relative weights of design and policies in the solutions to these problems? I think a lot of people will turn to you to ask about solutions. I mean,
Right.
I think, which is not necessarily your field of expertise, I would note. But yeah. I think that I think noting what is the relationship between design and policy is part of what you were arguing in
Sure.
the structure of the movie. And so I don't know if you have thoughts
Sure.
about how it can be extended.
Absolutely. Well, I don't know. I mean, it's obviously, it's a very open-ended question, but housing policy touches so many aspects of people's lives. Like, I think the biggest determining factor of whether people's ability to move up socioeconomically is completely based on the luck of what zip code they're born into. Place is such an overwhelmingly determining factor. And because of that, there's so many different problems and so many different solutions. But as designers or as architects, I feel like we're kind of the only discipline that is thinking critically about all these different issues and then trying to synthesize them into a kind of built form, thinking about it systemically. And so one basic solution I would say is that I feel like architects just need to become more involved at a city planning level, more involved with developers. I think for generations now, architects have been more in service of capital needs, and really our agency has been kind of eroded either between just from the kind of developer growth or just from the agency that engineers have. And I don't know, like if I were to diagnose our field, it just feels like we're a little bit sad, like sad sacks. but we need to be reinvigorated with a faith in our unique capabilities. But more specifically, like we got to screen this film. I was invited in October of 2018 to screen the film for the City Council of Minneapolis, who has luckily a very progressive city council that is actively looking to ameliorate these issues. And they brought together the Housing Commission and all these other people within city government to watch the film. And then 3 weeks later, they ended restrictive single family zoning in Minneapolis.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I remember when they made that decision. So that's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, of course, I'm sure the film played a small part in that. But you know, these are things, these are tiny little decisions that seem super boring on paper, but extrapolated out over generations have a profound effect on, of course, the design of cities and urban planning, but also like in the way that people's lives are shaped.
So there are several questions that actually can fit together that I think, so one way that we can engage is by voting, getting involved at the city level, as you say, being active politically. But another is, or an additional way is by creating a narrative like this and making a public statement, giving a public story about this issue. And so Giannini, Jonathan, and Sage all have questions really about the making of the movie. And so Giannini was asking how you decide on and connected with the people whose narratives you saw in the film. And then Jonathan and Sage both asked questions about essentially the finding of the archival work. How did you decide? So essentially all of the questions here, that little group of questions are asking sort of how did you decide what voices and then how to fit this stuff together? And how did you find all of that archival stuff?
Well, so for the first part, the film took about 4 years to shoot. For a variety of reasons. There wasn't any like specific reason it took a long time to make other than the fact that I had limited resources. But I think the film also benefited from that length because I think in documentary film, I feel like the best ones are reactive to the environment they're in and understand that the histories around them are changing and that the filmmaking then has to be dynamic to those changes. And so when I started the film, it was really specifically more of an architectural film about the commoditization of square footage and just what that had done to design. And, I was really kind of obsessed with these few data points, like the size of the average family in 1950, these are generalized, but this is generally right, was like 3.5 people per household in 1950 to today is 2.5 people. And then the average size of the single family home in 1950 was like 900 square feet. And today it's 2,700. So I became really interested in this idea of alienation and like what it meant to have fewer people occupying more air conditioned space and then what that looked like. And it was, I think could have been a very interesting film, maybe a bit navel gazing, but like interesting nonetheless. But then, the Baltimore uprising happened, Ferguson, the shooting of Michael Brown happened. And it became really clear to me that to make a film that was just so narrowly focused on critiquing suburbia was really leaving off the table the much bigger story about this sort of two sides of this coin, and that like the suburban sprawl and the commoditization of the single family home and this obsessive thinking about the transforming of the single family home into a globally traded commodity really came at the expense of inner city America. And so I found those stories really quite naturally. I mean, I went to Levittown because that seemed like the natural point to start talking about suburban sprawl. And I happened to be speaking with a group of retired police officers, most of whom you see in the film, but it also happened to be during the Baltimore uprising.
How did you come across them?
Oh, well, that was an LA story. I just happened to be at a party and I was talking to an old friend about what I was up to, and his wife's best friend grew up in Levittown, and she's the daughter of one of the guys.
Okay.
And so as soon as I got on the phone with him, within like 3 sentences, I was like, "You're gonna be in this movie." But it happened during the Baltimore uprising, and so these gentlemen were all consuming a very particular form of news media that were shaping their perspectives on what was happening in Baltimore at that time around the Freddie Gray uprisings.
Mm-hmm.
And they were so consumed by this refrain about, like, you know, we support your right to protest. You know, I served in the military, but, you know, you can't just burn your own neighborhood down. And this is like a common refrain that suburban America lobs at inner city America. And it struck me as like a very important question to answer for a certain group of people who don't maybe understand that they're looking at the world through a homeowner's mind, and that there's a whole group of other people who don't have ownership, and that's a really profound difference. And so it became clear that the point of the film needed to answer that question for Mr. Silvestri. And so then I went to Baltimore, and I was doing some ground research there, talking to different organizers, and wasn't really finding what I was hoping to find. And just like on a lunch break, 2 people I was with were talking about this kid, Greg, about the stabbing of the fire hose. Meanwhile, like 2 weeks before in Levittown, these guys were just obsessively talking about the kid that stabbed the fire hose. And I told my co-producer in Baltimore, like, "Wait, you guys know the kid that stabbed the fire hose?" Like, "Oh yeah, it's Greg. He just lives like 2 blocks over." I was like, "Let's talk to Greg." And Greg turned out to be an incredible person and an incredible storyline to talk about all these problems. And it wasn't until a week into filming with him that he also told me that at that time he was working with his uncle fixing up houses. Sorry, that was a long-winded way. So that's how I found those people. The archival is a much simpler explanation. It's just, I knew that the film wanted to be a kind of critique of this fever dream of advertisement and like the way that Americans in particular consume like housing pornography on HGTV and everything. And like this was all set into motion since the 50s. And so luckily our editor, Drew Blattman, is a maestro of archival and helped me find the pieces, and then really just let him do his thing. He's a real artist.
But how did you find, I mean, you clipped together the cartoons, the TV shows, the advertisements. I noticed I remember the last time I watched it, I watched the credits roll pretty slowly and noted that there were a lot of bubblegum bubblegum companies credited. So explain a little bit more about sort of the commercial background to some of these, how you got some of the material.
Well, it's all, I think at that time, so anytime you're using archival footage, you often have to hire a lawyer, a fair use attorney who basically clears all of that material for you and says like, okay, you can claim fair use on this, but you can't on this. Right. So there's a very specific set of parameters. So because a lot of the archival was being used as satire, it gave us pretty much carte blanche on what we were trying to do, but we set that lawyer's record for the most fair use claims, only to be beaten by our latest film, which is another story entirely. But what's that?
I'll let you plug that at the end.
Okay, thanks. But yeah, no, it's just, if you grow up in America, you don't think twice about it. But my dad's from Italy and my mother's from Venezuela, and it's just like a much different relationship with of course so many things, but especially like housing and just commoditization of everything and anything, and just this like kind of plasticine world that surrounds all of it. And I just really wanted like the American dream to feel like this fever dream that was its own character and storyline throughout the film that played itself throughout these archival pieces.
So Karen, who noted that you are too young to have grown up with All in the Family, even though you say you watched it, she asks who the audience is, who you envision when you were creating it. And I also had somewhat of a question on that front in terms of, I mean, I catch a lot of the references that you've clipped, but I wonder how accessible those are to a younger audience today, or an older audience maybe, but sort of what audience do you envision watching this?
It's interesting because, yeah, the references tend to be a little bit older, but All in the Family was really interesting because we were having these discussions in public in the 70s, and it seems like over time we've stripped out, or we've convinced ourselves that the American audience isn't capable of like having an intellectual conversation within sitcom television. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was, when we were just looking through different pieces of footage, we kept on coming back to All in the Family and generally the work of, oh gosh, now I'm forgetting his name. Just the legendary TV writer and producer who created All in the Family and all those shows. But he's a very political person, and it just seemed very relevant to me. I wanted to like remind people that these problems have existed for years, and they haven't really changed. And then there was a time when we were talking about them pretty candidly, but that you know, we've kind of swept it all under the rug. I am a little young for All in the Family, but those reruns played just constantly.
So then, I mean, I think
but for the audience, right?
Bring all of that. Yeah, who's the audience?
Well, so yeah, I mean, honestly, older people, I guess people like Jimmy and his friends in Levittown. Uh-huh. I wanted to retell their history back to them in a way that maybe they weren't like. I think Jimmy, they all sort of understand what happened, especially them, because they grew up. That was a real insight to me that I didn't fully appreciate when I started filming. And all those guys grew up in parts of New York that now we consider to be historically black neighborhoods. But at the time they were growing up, it was very integrated. And I think they carry with them a kind of guilt that is very palpable, and it manifests in really strange ways. And like Bill O'Reilly, the former disgraced TV host of Fox News fame, also grew up in Levittown. And when Jon Stewart interviewed him, I think it was maybe Jon Stewart's last interview he did on The Daily Show was with Bill O'Reilly. And the only thing that he wanted to convince Bill O'Reilly of was of his privilege, which is now, of course, this word that is inured of all of its meaning, or just shuts down conversations. But at that time, it was really powerful because he was like, Bill O'Reilly's position was, you know, I'm a hardworking guy. Like, I didn't get a handout. I got this tiny little house in Levittown. It was nothing. Like, we worked for everything. And Jon Stewart was like, yes, but that little shoebox of a home gave you stability. It plugged you into a brand new school system, and you had innumerable other kind of infrastructures around you to support you that other kids didn't. And so just recognize that. Yeah. And by the end of it, he recognizes it. So I was like, I want to do the film version of that. But oddly enough, younger audiences, when we screened it for Rice students, they certainly got the humor much more directly than older audiences. So I guess it's twofold, like anything else.
Our audience has told us that it's Norman Lear.
Norman Lear, there you go.
On. Yeah. Thank you, audience members, for filling in for Google. Our brains, neither one of us remembered that. Jessica had a couple of good questions. One, which I really appreciate, Jessica, that you ask, what factors led you to start the film's journey in post-war America? In your research, did you explore the clearance that occurred during Reconstruction and the 1910s, 1920s race massacres? And I, as a historian, I appreciate the stepping even further back. But is there, I mean, were you ever pulled further back when you were starting the movie?
Definitely. I mean, I think the film, if anything, was always about trying to figure out how to contain it, because like the regular note always was like, are you sure you can do this in 80 minutes? Or why don't you make a series out of this? And it's like, making a film on your own is hard enough. Like, I don't know if anyone who's made self-produced their own series, but that said, it felt like certainly, yes, there was a history beforehand, and I still am very interested in the story of Black Wall Street and Tulsa, but I feel like thankfully now people are starting to address that story in really beautifully creative ways. But it just felt like World War II till today is it's so vividly, when people talk about like Make America Great Again, I think the image that you have behind you is kind of that idyllic image that these people want to return to. So I guess back to your previous question, I think I wanted to remind people that like that was sort of built on a lie of some kind, and that there had to be a reckoning for that. So yeah, it felt like the film really needed to be set in a kind of more modern generation, especially the TV generation.
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. And I think, so Levittown is the backdrop that I have behind me, and this idea of the single family home. I think it's very interesting that you raised that example in Minneapolis of a recognition that just the zoning of single family housing is part of the zoning problem in the US. And so that dream that we all thought was so idyllic is deeply problematic at its base. But Levittown, as you say, you went to talk to the retired police guys in Levittown as a beginning, makes a lot of sense to me in that sense. Jessica goes on to ask actually a question you started with. At 8:01, you were the first question out of the box, Jessica. You asked, the film does a good job of documenting the chronological mistakes that have been made by both the governing bodies and housing providers following the 40s. But from your research, should we be considering the possibility that the mixed income housing phenomenon, as it's currently being delivered, is another misstep? So have you thought this through of sort of, I mean, I think this goes back to the question of, so what do we do to avoid the problem if one attempt is relying on mixed housing, mixed income housing? How do you think that's
right? Yeah, I think the conclusion I came to in some ways at the end of all this is that the housing problem is also masking really an income problem. So I would interrogate the general concept of mixed income, right? Because what we have now is a generation of artificially suppressed wages and a wealth accumulation of the highest echelons of that have created like a huge stratification. And so what the role of the government now is having to fill in that gap in all these crazy different ways. And so housing is the number one cost that any person has to incur. And so it creates these really impossible fixes that get resistance from conservatives who say, government can't spend this much, but also a lack of recognition that someone has to pay for it. Either companies need to pay more to their employees so that they can afford it, or, and I think that's where UBI comes in. This is another interesting conversation. But yeah, in terms of repeating mistakes, though, specifically mixed income construction, I mean, Pruitt-Igoe myth, I think, is a really good documentary that really talks about the failures of just isolating poverty and like what that does. I have to say, I'm not quite sure I've spent much time thinking about the mistakes of mixed income, but I'd be curious to know what the question asker's position on that might be.
So Jessica, you can step in with fleshing out that point a little bit more if you want, Jessica. But I mean, in the meantime, I think that there's another point that comes out of this, which is, so a documentary filmmaker, sometimes they focus on one area and they stay in that area and for their whole career, and they become an expert in a specific area. And others do what you've, I think, started to do, which is taking different topics and burrowing into them and then changing a topic with your next one, which is actually not that dissimilar from what an architect can do, right? And so talk a little bit about that of sort of, on the one hand, we look to you as an expert on the housing crisis, on post-war America, but then we ask you about further history, we ask you about different models. How do you bracket your expertise?
Yeah, it's interesting. I definitely learned very early on is don't talk about anything you don't really know a lot about. So, because I think that is definitely the case that people, It's very natural. If you make a topic, like a film about a topic, people assume that whether it's the question about what the solutions are, or like, you know, that you're an expert on every facet of it. At the end of the day, like I made Owned in part because I was really interested in the topic, and it really felt like no one was talking about it in the way that I was thinking about it. And it was this all-consuming thing. And I felt like if I didn't make it, I was really going to like rue the day because I knew that people would finally start caring about it. But it was really also just a way into filmmaking in general. Like, yeah, in terms of bracketing, I guess it was a means to make my first film. And I don't know that I'm going to continue making documentary films. I would definitely love to, but I think I'm still practicing architecture, and I'm working on scripted films. So I think in general, and I guess that's sort of what my architecture thesis was just about narratives in general, and just how different ways we can tell stories through different mediums. So, yeah.
Nice plug for thesis.
Thank you.
So that relates to a couple of questions of, let's see, Carly asks whether there were any topics you wanted to include or couldn't, or ones that you thought should have gotten more attention. And Alex asks that whether there were areas that you would expand on or focus more given the recent history, the 2-year history since then. So those are two different questions.
Yeah, I was really interested in going to other countries to talk about how other cultures value space, just to kind of show how constructed the phenomena is. Whether that was like in a place like Rio, where lower income people have had to be put in a situation where they create their own housing because of the lack of support from the government. They create billions of dollars worth of value in terms of affordable housing solutions that the state is not capable of doing. Or in Japan, where, you know, the idea of a home in some ways is more like a car. Like the home itself is not what has value. In fact, like there's a whole cultural lineage of tearing things down and rebuilding them. Just to kind of showcase the ephemeral qualities and the completely structured nature or constructed nature that value is in a culture, to get people to start thinking about different ways of how we could structure our housing economy, to maybe find a way to decommodify it or find other opportunities to fix it. And then what was the second question? Oh, that I would have liked to explore further.
Yeah. Well, there was sort of whether the events of the last 2 years make you, I mean, almost like, would you have done a sequel, or were there things that now you think you should have added in?
Yeah. I mean, I really wanted to spend more time with Greg. Unfortunately, he was going through a really tough time then, and it was hard to schedule with him. And he's had such an incredible life following the film. I wish I could have followed him. He's now like the assistant dean of this really prestigious charter school in Baltimore. But yeah, there was a story actually. So the vacant lot that Jimmy Silvestri, the cop, takes us to, that was this old housing block that he lived on. I was really interested in finding where all those people went. I just didn't have the resources to it. I asked several people at different housing organizations within the city of New York, and most of them didn't even have records of it. And in fact, the property itself is maintained now by the sanitation department. So it's like those families and those histories didn't exist. So in a dream scenario, I would have loved to have found the rent roll, like the last rent roll for that building, and tried to find where all of his neighbors went, and really track that as a story. That would have been really beautiful.
Do you have that makes me think, I mean, I think back to your thesis and your interest in narrative, and I think that example and the film generally points to your awareness that the combination of how people live in a place, but also the place itself, are absolutely joined through narrative. do you have, so we are, a good number of in our audience are incoming students to all of our programs, not just architecture, but do you have advice for them on how to use narrative in design?
I mean, the way I was interested in it was really, and I think this is really relevant to the discipline now and kind of the restructuring and reordering that we're seeing. My interest was really in trying to find ways that architects could communicate more fluidly with clients, so that like there was a real kind of transfer of intelligence rather than a kind of I don't know how to explain this cogently, that there's almost this sleight of hand sometimes with architecture where you're trying to legitimize to your client how you came up with this beautiful thing. And sometimes that happens through like a designer like Bjarke Engels gives you these flashy little simplistic diagrams that like sort of solve for the whole thing and force you into accepting its profound logic. Other people create a hyper dense sort of linguistical sets to the point that it just sort of you just have to submit to its brilliance, and I just felt like there's something much more profound that can be mined from more fluid connection, and that like storytelling of course is like what makes us human. And so if people could understand their decision making in designs through these kind of desires, I think it could result in better design. That like an archway is more than just an aesthetic thing, that there's maybe something else to be experienced of why you like an archway, or vaulted ceilings or whatever it is.
What about tone? Because I think going back to sort of who your audience is, I think a lot of your references are referencing moments of popular culture that speak to a generation even older than me, I would argue, or maybe my generation. But the use of satire or irony, I think, speaks more to your generation or younger. So,
sure.
Were you aware of sort of the role of tone and whether that has a generational mark to it?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I think when we screened it at Rice for Rice students, I was very delighted by the laughter that I felt like had been lacking, because we were playing at really great film festivals, but film festivals that tend to be a kind of older affair. And it was just a different relationship. So it was nice that the humor really played in a much different way with younger audiences. I think for sure we deploy it as a way to debase, of course, like the preconceived notions that are the maybe superficial message that the commercial or whatever is trying to communicate. You try to kind of subvert it to say what it's really about. And so there's like a whole nother conversation, I think, that younger audiences are having with themselves while they're watching. And certainly, again, like some of the poorer reviews of the film, I think, speak to that.
I want to return to some of the questions because I don't want to miss on something. So first of all, Jessica came back to us. Jessica, I too am undecided on whether mixed income housing is the answer. There's a lot to say here, indeed, but would point to the notion that mixed income apartment complexes that are being built around the country today are so new, we don't yet know their long-term implications for non-white households.
I see.
Dr. Mark Joseph at Case Western has done studies which looked at the mixed income model with a critical lens. Would love to hear you consider continuing your film work further to showcase where we go from here. So I think that's probably most everyone in the audience would love to see the sequel to Owned. I totally agree with that. There are more examples, I think, of mixed income developments in other countries, and it would be interesting to. I mean, there are here too, but it would be interesting to look at that. I think that's different from what you were looking at here.
Yeah, but I mean, again, I think it's just about who's getting to participate in even achieving mixed income, right? Like it's such a bigger question about who has access to jobs and how much people are making. I think in general, it seems to me at least that the idea of mixing low and upper income is a generally good thing if we're to take a lesson from the kind of Pruitt-Igoe era, right? That there is, and I believe that there is sociologists that have sort of confirmed this, that like just your proximity to wealth makes you more likely to like move up socioeconomically, that those kind of chance encounters that we always talk about in architecture school. Like, I don't know how many reviews I've sat through where people are like, this is the foyer where the chance encounter happens, you know, like that's like the go-to phrase for when you don't know how to talk about your project.
Well, the chance encounter that you had meeting the daughter of the cop in Lebanon.
That's true.
So
That's true.
Santiago Pagon wants to know your opinion on the lack of accessibility that underrepresented communities have to architects and the discipline in general. And I think that's an interesting question vis-a-vis the pairs that you're talking about, essentially the haves and the have-nots, or the sort of suburban McMansions on the one extreme, and then the housing in Baltimore on the other extreme. Can you speak to that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's something that I'm part of the group of alumni at Rice who are trying to help solve these issues at the graduate school there, or at the architecture school in general. But yeah, so we've been talking about this specific issue quite a bit. And, you know, I think, of course, diversity in faculty and diversity amongst students is incredibly important, but I think we have to pull even further back and understand that, like, for a huge set of the Black population, there's a lack of relevancy to architecture, because for many parts of inner city America, like, it's not a relevant experience to them because they've been forced to live in places that are in fact the absence of design. And there was an article that the New York Times published this weekend about just like how much hotter certain parts of the city are. Yeah. Just because of redlining, right? Like, that seems so impossibly cruel to me, that like you're literally making certain parts of the city up to 10 degrees hotter than white parts of the city. So I think we have to engage kids at an earlier age and get them interested in the field and get them to understand that there is a relevancy and the design is important, and that you know, that culture, the society has kind of failed them in that sense, but there's an interest in solving these issues, and they should be part of that conversation.
I absolutely agree. And I wanted to return to a question that was early on and I skipped over, which is Jarrett's question. I may have missed something, but it seems like the outside effect of the housing crash on minorities wasn't explored very much, though it seems to be implicitly connected with the opening up of housing loans after an era of limited access.
Yes.
What's your thinking on such a connection and its presentation in your film?
For sure. Yeah. And that goes back to another question about something I wish I could have spent more time exploring. I mean, and to the audience question, right? Like, the audience for this film was really for white suburban America to sort of reckon with their past. So there was some editorial decisions about, like, you know, what would be more relevant to that audience. That said, for sure, that's a huge part of the story. And I think very early on in the project, I went to this lecture at CUNY with Raquel Rolnick, who's a Brazilian urban planner. And I think at that time she was the UN special envoy to affordable housing around the globe. And she was talking about the crisis in ways that I'd never really thought about before. And her position was that, and I think it's absolutely true, is that the mortgage crisis and the disproportionate effect that it had on low-income people was in part the problem of a complete dearth of affordable housing options, right? You give a whole generation of people poor access to jobs and then no affordable housing options. And then all of a sudden on the TV, you see these commercials for like, oh, you don't need just no income, no asset loan. We'll give you $400,000 with your signature. And it's like, you're telling a bunch of desperate people who need housing, they can get a free loan. Well, of course they're going to take that. And then of course there was this disgusting, like narrative that came on right-wing media at that time that, you know, that the real cause of the crisis were all these people, these desperate people who were taking loans that they knew they couldn't afford. And that would definitely be a story worth revisiting, because you're seeing it crop up again today, for sure.
How much were you aware of these issues when you were an architecture student?
Not really at all, I'm being quite honest. I don't think it was part of any history class we took, certainly. I think, of course, the concept of suburbia was often very criticized, of course, like in direct and indirect ways, like Learning from Las Vegas and all these kinds of like postmodernist theories definitely had that built into them in terms of critiques on the kind of commercialization. And then sorry, what's the professor's name at Princeton? Beatrice.
Colomina.
Yeah, Colomina. She had a great book about it, but it never. Yeah, it was a great reference for me, for sure. Shout out to her. But yeah, I don't think that I was as aware of it, and it was certainly an educational process for me doing this film. Absolutely.
So we're coming up on sort of towards the end of this. I don't know if people have additional questions that they want to answer, but I wondered if so, again, these are students who are starting off in the school in many programs: architecture, urban planning, design, landscape, our Master of Design Engineering, our Doctor of Design. Now I can be the advertisement for the GSD. All these programs that we have.
Oh, wow.
And so what advice do you have for them as graduate students? Oh, wise Giorgio. What would you have done differently, in another way of putting it?
I guess don't ever feel too small to think that you can't be a voice. Maybe not so much in school, but like as you enter your early careers, you're going to naturally have different sensitivities to certain aspects about how the world is constructed. And I feel like when you're on those teams, when you're in those meetings with developers, when you're talking about schematic design and the implications of what you're doing, like speak up, and be the voice of change from yourself, and don't feel like you're just a single person can't make a difference, because I think that's why we're all here. that complacency and that kind of cynicism is not helpful. And you guys are presumably the most intelligent group of students out there besides Rice students, so you should naturally be the ones solving these issues. So speak up.
We do have two more questions on the docket, so let's get to those before we close. One, Santiago Pagan comes again with a question making me think of Puerto Rico. Levittown served as a model for many developments in the island that were made according to that model by himself as well, with the help of the government as well. Apart from economics, do you think that developing these types of urbanizations could entail some qualities of colonialization over territories to maintain a certain type of social status, to control and maintain a desired status of living?
It's a really good question. Yes, I guess it's all of it for sure. I mean, Bill Levitt kind of infamously said when he was building Levittown that he could we could either solve the race problem or solve the housing crisis, but we couldn't do both things. And I think that's kind of the most damning aspect of it. And it's part of the reason why I wanted to juxtapose that storyline with the Mar Vista story and what Gregory Ain was trying to do at the very same time. So yeah, I think you see it in China now too, certainly. Just the concept of home ownership, again, at the end of the day, I think the film more generally is a kind of critique on what happens when you build a housing economy along this conceit that a home is necessarily existing to accrue value, that it's like a commodity that must increase, year over year by 5%, and you're going to do anything you can at all costs to maintain that value. And what happens in that kind of situation is it necessarily teases out the kind of worst aspects in humanity. On the financial side, you have banks who prey upon people and take advantage of this kind of like feverish desire to feed the beast. And then on the cultural side, if you carry with you these racist beliefs that black families necessarily bring property values down, which of course is not a true statement. The cat tail is incredible.
All right. Yes.
But,
I have a dog, I have a cat.
it's great. That like on the cultural side, if you're a racist person and you believe black homeowners bring your property values down, you're going to do everything you can to prevent black families from moving into your neighborhood. So for sure, that's a very colonialist mindset, and we should think critically about the relationship between these kind of on paper very doctrinaire or boring kind of things and like what their impact actually has more globally.
And I think you're absolutely right to say that this is continuing as a form of colonialization. The single family home as an issue across the world now, and how the suburban model of that has been creating this kind of version. I think colonialization is absolutely right. Marcel, your question on how the field of architecture and design is responding and evolving in the context of climate change and climate gentrification, I think speaks a little bit to the comment you made about the New York Times article and the recognition that climate and forms of structural racism actually are very tied, or climate considerations, right?
For sure. Yeah, and just last question too, of course, like suburban sprawl, this is of course like a horribly damaging ecologically, no doubt.
No, absolutely. So I wanted to close with Karen's question, which is really nicely put. So Karen Janowski, the phenomenon that you empathetically and perhaps too sweetly portray in the film is sad but true and potent. Immigrants that were considered Italian, Irish, Eastern European, then engage in flight from the Black population. What influenced the way in which you decided to portray this topic? Thank you for such a wonderful film.
Thank you. That's interesting. I mean, my relationship to my heritage is a little bit different maybe than other Italian Americans, because my dad is an actual immigrant who came here in the late 70s, but like did not speak very much English, and, you know, was in Houston in the late 70s. And that's the kind of world that I grew up in, like to the extent that in the summers when I got more sun, I would be often called Mexican, as pejoratively as that can be read at the time. And it is something that like, I do think about all the time about this, that people have started talking about it more publicly now, but just the idea of earned whiteness. And yeah, maybe she said that I put it too sweetly. Yeah, that's interesting. I never thought about how I actually portrayed that, more than how I don't know. I think behind it, there's an interesting, with Jimmy and all the guys eating meatballs, I guess it was like in the Italian restaurant scene. There's a kind of,
yeah, there are a lot of meatballs in that
There's
scene.
a lot of meatballs being eaten, but there's also kind of escapism there to their past. And in fact, one of them is actually Puerto Rican, but sort of adopts an Italian kind of idea, because at that time, him growing up, like Italians had earned whiteness, as Puerto Ricans had not. And so he could kind of code switch in that way. So there was definitely a lot to mine there. And it's definitely something I think about a lot, but it's a very astute question. Thank you for asking. Excellent.
Well, thank you for giving us the film. Wonderfully timed, unfortunately, I will say. But I do hope that your film and the screening of it, not just to our audience, but the continued screening of it, will help people understand some of some of the conditions that have created these disparities physically and urbanistically in the country. And so I think that it's also interesting. I mean, we are reading Richard Rothstein's book, The Code of Law. I think a lot of people know Nicole Hannah-Jones's 1619 Project. I think there's a lot of different forms of narrative and media dealing with this question that we all should be mining and appreciating, that as a varied audience, we can reach this question and talk about these issues and ideally formulate answers to these issues through different forms of media and narrative.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
At this point, there would be applause, so you can just count on that. But thank you very much, and we look forward to bringing you back in person at some point.
Thank you very much. And if I can just say, if you like the film, go to Amazon and review it. It does help us out a lot. The algorithms, they assume that if people are leaving a lot of reviews, that it should be something they should show to other viewers who are looking for similar films. So, sorry.
So why don't you exit by telling us what your new project is?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So September 4th, our new film, it's called Feels Good Man. It's about cartoonist Matt Fury, the creator of the now infamous Pepe the Frog cartoon.
Yeah.
So we premiered at Sundance this year, and my partner and I won the Emerging Filmmaker Award.
Fabulous.
Yes, I'm really proud of it. My partner is Arthur. He's the director. He actually did all the animations and graphic work on Owned, and that's how we met. And so we just decided to continue working together, and he invited me on this journey. And it's a equally very important film about, I was actually thinking about this recently, about how they're tied together, because I think you instilled in me this interest in, you give us this exercise to all this thesis students to look back at all their work and see if there's a common thread.
Exactly.
And actually it's really interesting. I think, like, ostensibly it's a film about a stoned cartoon frog, but it's really about the internet and digital infrastructure and how the commoditization of digital infrastructure has kind of divided us. And there's definitely very clear parallels between that and the subject of Owned and kind of physical infrastructure. So it's exciting, to say the least.
Excellent. Well, we look forward to seeing that. So September 4th, that opens. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Really good seeing you. Thank you very much.
Likewise. Very good to see you too. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.